The day my husband's family finally showed me who they truly were began long before anyone raised their voice or cast their cutting glances across the room. It began the moment I stepped out of the car and felt the weight of eyes that had never truly welcomed me settle on my skin like dust from an old room, familiar, irritating, and impossible to ignore. And even though I tried to tell myself that I was overreacting or being sensitive, something inside me tightened with the quiet certainty that this day would reveal truths I had spent years avoiding. I had always known they didn't like me, not truly, not in the way family is meant to hold you close, not in a way that feels like belonging. From the beginning, I was treated like a guest they never invited but tolerated because their son chose me. And even though he always defended me, there were unspoken tensions, looks exchanged behind my back, whispers that faded whenever I entered the room, and a coldness that could freeze the warmest morning. But somehow, someway I kept trying, kept showing up, kept hoping that if I did enough, gave enough, smiled enough, maybe one day they would see me as more than an outsider. I don't know why I believed that. Maybe because I was raised to believe that family is something you earn through effort, patience, and humility, but standing there, staring at the tall gates of his parents' house, I felt something shift in me, something small but powerful, like the first crack in a wall that had been holding back years of hurt. The occasion was supposed to be a celebration. His father's 70th birthday, the kind of event people dress up for, the kind people take pictures at, the kind where everyone tries their best to look perfect, polished, united. But beneath the bright decorations and the expensive tents, there was a tension in the air I couldn't name, a heaviness that slipped under my skin as I walked in, my steps steady but my stomach unsettled. I could already see them scanning me from head to toe, my mother-in-law with her sharp, measuring eyes that never softened for me, his aunt who always found a way to remind me that my husband could have done better, his cousins who smiled at me the way people smile at someone they don't respect but try to hide it with politeness. I felt their energy before I heard their voices, and it pressed against me like a warning, but I kept walking, holding the small gift bag in my hand, feeling its weight and remembering how long I had spent picking something thoughtful. I told myself that today would be different, that maybe happiness could find a place here, but even before I reached the main tent, something inside me whispered that I was lying to myself again. I saw my husband across the compound, laughing with his siblings, his shoulders relaxed, his face bright, unaware of the storm rolling toward me from the corners of the family that claimed to love him but always made me feel like an intruder in his joy. He waved at me, the kind of wave that reminded me why I loved him, the kind of gesture that made the whole world feel softer for a moment. But the moment didn't last long because as soon as I got close enough to greet the rest of them, the reality of my place in this family became painfully clear. The first comment was disguised as a joke, as usual. The kind that stings but comes wrapped in a smile, the kind people defend by saying they were only teasing. The next one came with a sigh, a backhanded compliment about my dress, an unnecessary remark about how I should have come earlier to help, as if my presence was only valuable if it served them. Then came the subtle shoves, the dismissive gestures, the way they called other women over to take pictures but didn't include me, as if my existence would ruin their perfect family image. I felt myself shrinking the way I always did around them, folding into a smaller version of myself, and for a moment I almost obeyed that familiar instinct to stay quiet, stay invisible, stay agreeable. But something was different in me today, something I couldn't fully explain. Maybe it was exhaustion, maybe it was anger, maybe it was the years of swallowing insults that finally refused to go down my throat. But as I stood there, surrounded by people who treated me like a stain they couldn't scrub out, I felt my heart beat harder, louder, more urgently, as if it was telling me that today would not end the way every other family gathering had ended. There was a shift inside me, a quiet rebellion rising through my body like slow fire, and for the first time I didn't feel like running away. I felt like watching, observing, letting their actions record themselves in my memory without flinching. And as I stood there pretending to smile, pretending not to notice the way they kept handing me the most inconvenient tasks, the way they spoke around me instead of to me, the way they expected me to be grateful for crumbs of acknowledgement, the strangest thought entered my mind, a thought that made my breath catch. What if today is the day they finally understand who I am? What if today is the day everything changes? The wind shifted, carrying the scent of food and the sound of laughter mixed with something darker, something electric, and in that moment I didn't yet know what was coming, but I could feel it rising in the air like a gathering storm, something waiting to break open, something that would turn their world, and mine, upside down in a way none of us could have predicted. And even though I couldn't explain it, I felt oddly calm, as if somewhere deep inside, I knew that after today nothing about this family or my place in it would ever be the same again. From the moment I stepped further into the compound, something inside me kept tightening, as if every breath I took was rubbing against a bruise I'd learned to pretend wasn't there, and I could feel the familiar heaviness of being in this family press itself against my skin with the same coldness I had known from the first day I was introduced to them. Yet mixed into that heaviness was a strange awareness, a quiet whisper that today would stretch me in ways I hadn't expected. As I moved through the crowd, offering polite greetings, nodding at faces that never looked at me long enough to see me, I felt the eyes of his mother follow me, sharp and disapproving, the way someone watches a problem they intend to solve later. She didn't speak at first. She allowed the silence to do the work, letting her disapproval sit on the air like something heavy and sour, and even though she didn't say a word, I felt it all over my body. The women around her were already whispering, not loudly enough for me to hear the words, but loud enough for me to feel the intention behind them, and as I kept walking, the ground beneath me felt uneven, as if I was stepping into a place where the version of me they expected was being peeled away layer by layer, revealing someone they were not ready for. It wasn't that I was dressed differently or speaking differently or acting differently, it was the way I carried myself, a quiet steadiness that didn't bow the way it used to, and even though I was trying to mind my own space, they sensed something had shifted in me long before I said anything at all. I could feel the stairs gathering behind me like shadows as I reached the section where the younger cousins were arranging chairs, their energy chaotic, loud, unfiltered, but ironically more genuine than the adults who hid cruelty behind politeness. One of them asked for help with the decorations, not politely, not softly, but with the tone of someone giving an instruction to a maid, and my instinct was to obey, to disappear into the background the way this family always trained me to do, yet something inside me refused to respond. I kept walking, not rudely, not aggressively, but with a calm that didn't need explanation, and the confusion on their faces was almost laughable. They were not used to me choosing myself. They were not used to me existing outside the mold they created for me. And the more I moved through the space, the clearer it became that my silence was unsettling them more than any argument ever could. My husband spotted me again from across the compound, his face lighting up with the warmth that always made me feel seen in a world that often tried to blur me out. And for a brief second I wanted to run to him, to cling to the only place that ever felt like home in this family. But something in me said no, not because I doubted him, but because I needed to face this day on my own feet, not leaning on him as a shield. I needed to witness everything clearly without interference, without comfort softening the edges, because something deeply buried in this family was rising to the surface. And for once, I wanted to meet it with the full strength of who I was becoming. He walked toward me anyway, smiling, asking if I was okay, and I nodded, careful and composed, telling him I was fine in that wordless way couples understand. He kissed my forehead gently before being pulled away by his brothers, who barely acknowledged me as they dragged him back into their loud conversation. I watched them laugh with the careless ease of people who had never been made to feel unwelcome in their own family, and that ease pierced me with a loneliness I couldn't name. I kept moving, determined not to let the crowd swallow me, and soon I reached the food area where the women were arranging trays, their hands moving quickly, their chatter stiff and pointed, each one performing helpfulness for the sake of reputation, not kindness. The moment they saw me approach, the atmosphere changed. It wasn't hostility exactly. It was a tightening, a shift in posture, as if they had been discussing me just seconds before and were now waiting to see if I would notice. One of the women nudged another, signaling me without words, and before I could react, someone shoved a stack of plates into my hands with the casual entitlement of someone who sees another person as labor, not family. The weight shocked me, not because the plates were heavy, but because the gesture was so blatant, so careless, as if they believed I had arrived at the event for the sole purpose of serving them. And perhaps somewhere along the line, that is exactly what I had allowed them to believe. I felt my heart pick up speed, not in fear but in awakening, in realization, in that sharp moment when your body suddenly remembers who you truly are. I placed the plates down gently on the nearest table, not making a scene, not calling attention to myself, just quietly refusing the role they had assigned me. The room went still for a moment. They looked at me as if I had violated an unspoken contract, as if my refusal to carry plates meant I had broken some invisible rule in this hierarchy they cherished. One of the older women muttered something under her breath, something meant to shame me, but the words didn't land the way she intended. If anything, they clarified the truth I had been avoiding. It didn't matter how kind I was, how helpful, how respectful. This family had never intended to see me as equal. I had been performing worthiness for people who had already decided who I was in their story. But as their judgment tightened around me like a grip, I felt another truth rise inside me, something stronger, something anchored in the quiet dignity I had carried long before I married into this family. I wasn't their servant. I wasn't their charity case. I wasn't their background character. I was a woman who had built herself from scraps of pain and hope, a woman who had survived heartbreaks they would never know, a woman whose value didn't shrink because someone else refused to see it. And as that awareness settled into my bones, I realized with a clarity that felt almost spiritual that I was done asking for acceptance from people who thrived on withholding it. A slight breeze moved through the compound, lifting the edge of the tablecloths, rustling the decorations, carrying the faint scent of grilled meat and perfume, and for a moment, everything around me moved in slow motion. I watched my mother-in-law from across the tent, her face pulled tight with disapproval, her eyes narrowing as she realized I was not following the script. The realization unsettled her. It unsettled them all. A shift in energy rippled through the space, subtle but unmistakable, as if the air itself had noticed my refusal to shrink and was now waiting to see what would happen next. Then came the moment that changed everything. Not loud, not dramatic, just quietly revealing. One of the servers accidentally dropped a bowl of stew, and the thick liquid splashed across the floor, staining the white tiles. Before anyone else reacted, all eyes turned to me. It was instinctive, immediate, automatic, as if my presence alone meant I was responsible for cleaning up everyone's mess, literal or emotional. They did not even consider bending down themselves. They simply looked at me, waiting, expecting, assuming. And for the first time I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I stood there, steady, calm, fully present in my refusal. The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut through. Someone muttered something about women like me who forget themselves. Another whispered that marriage had made me proud. Another said they always knew I was disrespectful beneath the surface. And as the whispers spread, I felt the truth land in my chest. Not a painful truth, but a liberating one. I had never been the problem. Their entitlement was. No one cleaned the spill. They simply stepped around it, choosing to preserve their pride rather than bend down and do the work. And in that small, ridiculous moment, I saw the entire family dynamic clearly. A house built on hierarchy, insecurity, ego, and a deeply rooted belief that worth came from control, not love. And I understood something even deeper. Today was not the day they broke me. Today was the day I finally saw them without the softness of hope blurring the edges. As I stepped back, my pulse steady, my voice silent but powerful, I felt something open inside me, a door to a strength I had forgotten I possessed. And in that moment, even before the real storm of the day arrived, I knew with complete certainty that something irreversible had already begun. I woke up the next morning with that heavy sensation I used to feel as a child when I knew my mother was angry but hadn't yet spoken. A quiet weight in the air. A silence that carried judgment even when no words were said out loud. That was exactly how the house felt when I opened my eyes. Not because anyone was awake and accusing me, but because the memories of everything from the previous evening still lived in the walls. The words Lydia threw at me. The faces they made when I stood up for myself. The way the children watched the whole scene wide-eyed as if witnessing a stranger suddenly grow a spine. I lay there for a long time, staring at the ceiling, letting the shame, confusion, and simmering anger mix inside me until it created something that didn't feel like weakness anymore. It felt like decision. It felt like a woman who had finally tasted the first drop of her own freedom and didn't want to spit it out. I kept telling myself I should get up, that staying in bed wouldn't change anything, but the truth was I didn't want to enter a room where I would have to perform humility again. Not after my family tried to turn me into free labor for a wedding I wasn't even respected enough to participate in as a guest. My body moved slowly, as if each limb held the weight of all the years I had swallowed insults and called it peace. When I finally sat up, I let my legs dangle for a moment, rubbing my palms together as if I needed to warm myself before stepping back into their world. But my world had shifted. And in that shift, something inside me told me I no longer owed anyone the version of myself they were comfortable with. I walked to the bathroom, washed my face, and stared at the mirror. There was a tired woman there, yes, but also a woman who looked like she was meeting herself for the first time. A woman who had spent her whole life softening her voice, shrinking her presence, folding herself to fit inside other people's expectations. And now, for once, she didn't flinch at her reflection. She didn't apologize for existing. She didn't feel guilty for wanting to be treated with basic dignity. It felt strange, almost dangerous, to recognize myself as someone who deserved better. By the time I stepped out of the room, the house was fully awake. I could hear voices downstairs, whispers at first, then the sharper tone of someone trying to emphasize a point. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, they all went silent. It was the kind of silence that made you feel like a crime had been committed, and you were the accused. My eyes scanned each of their faces. Lydia's stiff posture, my sister-in-law's pursed lips, the scattered cousins pretending not to stare. Even the children seemed quieter than usual, as if sensing the adults were performing a ritual of tension. I walked past them without greeting anyone. That alone was enough to shake the room. In our family, silence was considered war. Women were expected to greet first, smile first, apologize first, even when they had done nothing wrong. But that morning, I didn't have the energy to carry anyone's traditions on my back. My aunt finally broke the silence. "So you didn't sleep well, Abby?" It wasn't really a question. It was bait. An invitation to downplay my feelings so they could blame me for overreacting later. But I didn't bite. "I slept fine," I said, my voice calm, steady, and unfamiliar even to me. "I'm only coming downstairs now because I took my time." They exchanged looks. The kind of looks people give when they don't recognize the person standing in front of them anymore. There was a tiny thrill inside me, a small spark of satisfaction at the confusion on their faces. It felt good to be unreadable for once. I made myself tea and sat down without waiting for permission. The room remained stiff, but I didn't offer to soften it. That responsibility had been mine for too long. After a long moment, my cousin cleared her throat. "So, about yesterday," she said carefully. I didn't look up. "What about it?" "We were just surprised you reacted like that," she continued. "You know how everyone is stressed because of the wedding." Lydia didn't mean anything. I didn't respond. I didn't have to. "And," she pushed on gently, "we all know you're good with kids. It wasn't anything bad." Finally, I looked up. Not with anger, but with truth. "It wasn't about being good with kids," I said. "It was the expectation that I should serve while everyone else gets to enjoy themselves. It was the entitlement." It was the way she spoke to me. No one argued. They just looked uncomfortable. My aunt sighed. "We all say things when we're stressed. Let it go." I stared at her, realizing that this had always been the script. I must let things go even when they cut me. I must make myself small so others can be big. I must swallow humiliation for the sake of their peace. But I wasn't hungry for their peace anymore. "I'm not angry," I said softly. "I'm just done." It shocked them, the softness of my voice, the firmness beneath it. Done didn't mean fighting. Done meant walking away. Done meant refusing to play my assigned role. Done meant boundaries. Before they could respond, Lydia walked in. Her face looked tight, like she hadn't slept. She stopped when she saw me. For a moment I thought she might apologize. Instead, she folded her arms as if preparing for battle. "So," she said, "are you still coming to the wedding or not?" Her tone was disrespectful, but this time it didn't sting the way it used to. I had already taken back the part of myself she used to injure. "I'll come," I said, finishing my tea. "But not to babysit." Her jaw clenched. "The kids need someone." "Yes," I replied. "Someone. Not me." The entire room froze again, but inside me there was only quiet, honest stillness. "You're making this difficult," she said sharply. "No," I said. "I'm making it clear." A long, heavy silence followed. And then something unexpected happened. My daughter, who had been sitting quietly on the couch, stood up and walked toward me. She didn't say anything. She simply sat beside me, leaned her head on my shoulder and held my hand. That small gesture cut deeper than any argument, because she had watched everything. She had heard the tone they used with me. She had seen the way they treated me. And she chose a side without words. I realized then that the woman I was becoming was necessary, not just for me but for her. She needed a mother who didn't apologize for existing. A mother who showed her what dignity looked like in real time. A mother who didn't teach her to shrink for anyone. I squeezed her hand gently. She didn't let go. Lydia looked away, irritated. My aunt sighed loudly, the cousins whispered, and the room struggled to adjust to a version of me they couldn't control anymore. But I felt nothing except a strange, quiet power settling into my bones. For the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of how they saw me. I was only afraid of who I might become if I went back to being the person they preferred. And as I sat there with my daughter beside me, I made an unspoken promise to myself. A promise that the old version of me, the one who tolerated disrespect for the sake of family harmony, was never returning. Something was changing slowly but surely, and none of them understood it yet. But they would. They would soon. The morning passed in a strange, heavy quietness, the kind that fills the air when everyone is waiting for someone else to make the first move. But I didn't move. I didn't rush to explain myself or soften anything, or bend my spine back into the shape of the woman they preferred. I let them sit in the discomfort of seeing me as someone they could no longer control with guilt. I stayed at the dining table longer than necessary, sipping my tea slowly, letting them see I had no intention of returning to the old patterns. Each sip felt like reclaiming a decade of swallowed words. Around mid-morning, I stepped outside for fresh air. The sky was pale blue, the kind of color that looks washed out as if the sun itself was tired, and the breeze carried a chill that reminded me I wasn't home anymore, at least not in the way home used to feel. My chest felt tight, but it wasn't the suffocating tension of fear anymore. It was the tightness of releasing long-held pressure, like a bow finally relaxing after years of being pulled to breaking point. As I stood there, I realized the house behind me had always been a metaphor. Pretty on the outside, cracked and decaying on the inside. And I had been trying to cover those cracks with patience, silence, and endurance. But the cracks weren't mine to fix. They belonged to the people who created them. I had just been living in the middle of their brokenness for so long that I began to mistake their chaos for my normal. I heard the door open behind me, quiet but intentional. I didn't turn. I already knew it was my daughter by the pattern of her breathing. She came to stand beside me, slipping her hand into mine without saying anything. The simplicity of that gesture felt like a balm to all the invisible wounds on my spirit. She knew everything without me explaining. Children always know, even when adults pretend they don't understand what they're witnessing. After a long silence, she leaned her head against my arm. In that moment, I felt the weight of motherhood press gently but firmly into my heart. I had spent years protecting her from the way her father's family treated me. I pretended it didn't hurt so she wouldn't grow up thinking love required suffering. But in doing so, I had taught her something even worse. That silence was safety. That endurance was strength. That shrinking yourself was the price of being accepted. Now she was watching me unlearn all of it in real time. Eventually, I squeezed her hand and we went back inside. The house felt even heavier now, as if it could sense the shift happening within me. The family was scattered in different rooms, pretending to be busy, but I knew they were listening for my footsteps, waiting to see what version of me would come back through the hallway. I went to my room and closed the door, allowing my body to collapse onto the bed. Not out of defeat, but out of emotional exhaustion. Strength was tiring. Boundaries were tiring. Growth was tiring. Every time you chose yourself after years of choosing others, your soul trembled like a newborn learning how to use its limbs. I lay there, staring at the ceiling again, but this time my thoughts weren't scattered. They were sharp, clear, focused, and they kept circling around the idea that I no longer wanted to be useful to people who didn't see my humanity. I was tired of performing gratitude for crumbs, tired of playing the role of the quiet wife, the polite in-law, the ever-available helper, tired of being the person people turned to only when they needed something from me, never when they wanted to offer something to me. I realized then why Lydia's words hurt so much. It wasn't the insult itself. It was the confirmation of what they had always believed, that my worth to them was tied to my labor, my obedience, and my silence. They didn't see me. They saw a tool. And when a tool refuses to work, people don't negotiate with it. They replace it. A soft knock broke my thoughts. I didn't answer. The door opened anyway, another sign of the entitlement that had become their unspoken language. I expected to see Lydia, ready to lecture me about family obligations. But instead it was one of the cousins. A younger girl around her early 20s with a gentle face and nervous hands. She hovered at the door like someone approaching an animal she wasn't sure was safe. I didn't sit up. I simply turned my head slightly to acknowledge her presence. She stepped inside, closing the door quietly, then sat on the edge of the bed. For a moment she said nothing. Just breathed. Her fingers twisted around each other, a habit she had even as a child when she was unsure how to express herself. Finally, she spoke in a soft voice. She said she heard everything yesterday. She said she saw how they talked to me. She said she saw how I stood my ground. And then, almost in a whisper, she said she wished she had that kind of courage. Her admission surprised me. Not because she admired me, but because she understood something none of the older women in that house had ever cared to see. She said she was tired too. Tired of watching the women in the family shrink every time the men entered the room. Tired of seeing the older aunties treat dignity like an option only the bold could afford. Tired of everyone pretending obedience was a virtue when it was really just fear dressed up in cultural expectations. Her voice cracked when she said she didn't want to become like them. I sat up then. Not because she needed me to, but because I finally realized I wasn't the only one suffocating in that house. For years I thought my silence was harmless, that keeping peace was a noble thing. But now I was looking into the eyes of a younger woman who had inherited the consequences of that silence. And suddenly it didn't feel noble. It felt generational. It felt like a cycle I had unconsciously helped continue. I spoke to her in a calm, steady tone, telling her I wasn't brave, I was simply tired. That boundaries weren't acts of rebellion, but acts of self-preservation. That the moment you start believing you deserve better, your body refuses to tolerate disrespect. That dignity feels like a luxury until you realize it's the only thing that keeps you from disappearing. She listened with an intensity that humbled me. And for the first time since the chaos began, I felt like someone in that family truly heard me. When she left the room, I felt lighter. Not because the problem was solved, but because the narrative had shifted. I wasn't alone in the fight anymore. Someone else understood the depth of the wound. Later that afternoon there was a knock at the door again. Firmer this time. I knew who it was before the handle turned. Lydia. She entered without waiting for permission. Her presence filled the room like a storm warning. She stood by the door with her arms folded, her posture stiff with resentment. I could tell she had been waiting all day to confront me. She started talking before the door even clicked shut. She used the same tone she always used. Sharp, dismissive, dripping with the kind of authority she believed she had over me. She said I embarrassed her. She said she didn't understand why I made everything so dramatic. She said family was supposed to help family. She said I should apologize for making her look bad. But the whole time she spoke, I looked at her with a strange sense of detachment, like a person who has finally woken up from a long sleep and sees the world clearly for the first time. She asked if I had anything to say. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to argue, defend myself, or explain anything. I only said one thing. I told her I wasn't going back to the woman she could step on. The way she froze just for a moment told me she heard me. Really heard me. She left the room without another word. And as the door closed behind her, I felt something shift again inside me. Not anger, not pride, not relief. Just clarity. The kind that only comes when a woman finally chooses herself. The day moved with a strange slowness, as if time itself were observing me, waiting to see what I would do next. It felt like I had crossed some invisible threshold, and now every step I took carried a weight I hadn't felt before. Not the weight of fear or shame or submission, but the weight of becoming. Becoming a woman who had finally stepped out of the mold they built for her. Becoming someone who no longer bowed her head before speaking. Becoming a version of myself I had buried so deeply under responsibilities and expectations that even I had forgotten she existed. But now she was emerging piece by piece, breath by breath, and the house could feel it too. By evening, I could sense the tension thickening in the air again. Lydia avoided me all day, but I saw her whispering with my aunt, with my sister-in-law, with anyone who would listen. They moved through the house with the frantic energy of people trying to strategize against a threat they didn't fully understand. And that threat was simply me choosing myself. It was almost laughable how fragile their authority was, how easily disrupted by the absence of my usual obedience. As the hours passed, I decided I didn't want to carry the heaviness into my sleep. I needed space to breathe, to think, to feel. So I stepped outside again. The sky had darkened completely, the kind of night that wrapped itself around you like a blanket. The street was quiet, with only a few distant car sounds and the soft rustling of trees in the wind. I stood at the edge of the driveway, letting the cool air wash over my skin, grounding me. I thought about everything that had led me here. The years of enduring small humiliations, the subtle digs, the heavy expectations. How I had convinced myself their behavior wasn't that bad. How I excused certain comments because they were family. How I let myself believe that if I remained peaceful, one day they'd see my worth. But peace offered as a sacrifice is not peace, it's surrender. And I realized I had been surrendering for far too long. As I stood in the quiet night, memories started to rise, uninvited but familiar. Moments from the early years of my marriage. Instances when his family would make jokes that were not jokes. Times they would talk over me, dismiss my ideas, or treat me like an afterthought. Moments when they assumed my presence meant service. How many times had I cooked for gatherings while everyone else enjoyed? How many times had I kept silent because speaking up felt like a battle I didn't have the energy to fight? I had tolerated all of it. Not because I was weak, but because I was tired. Tired of explaining myself. Tired of trying to fit into a family that had already decided where I belonged, beneath them. But something inside me had changed. Grown. Awakened. I went back inside after a long while, noticing the hush that fell over the room the moment I entered. They pretended not to watch me, but their eyes followed every move I made. I went to the kitchen, poured myself water, and sat at the dining table alone. The room felt like a theater stage, and I was the uncooperative actor refusing to say my lines. A few minutes later, my aunt entered. She moved slowly, like someone approaching a wounded animal. She sat across from me, smoothing her wrapper with unnecessary attention. For a while she didn't speak. I could tell she was rehearsing her words. She finally leaned forward and began to talk, her tone carefully softened, the way people speak when they need you to agree with them. She said she understood my feelings. She said weddings brought stress. She said family dynamics were complicated. She said Lydia spoke harshly but not from a bad place. She said I had to consider the bigger picture. She said I needed to be the mature one. She said I shouldn't take everything so personally. With every sentence, I realized she wasn't here to understand me. She was here to restore order. To put me back into the position that made their world comfortable. I listened quietly without interrupting. And when she finally fell silent, waiting for me to agree, I looked at her with a calmness that surprised even me. I told her I was done being the only one expected to understand everyone. I was done being the one who absorbed disrespect. I was done pretending the way they treated me was normal. I said it softly, but the softness made it even more piercing. She blinked in surprise. She wasn't used to me standing my ground without shaking. She tried again, insisting I was reading too much into things. But I told her gently that sometimes survival teaches you to read between lines that others ignore. That I wasn't angry. I was simply aware. Her expression changed then. Slightly. A flicker of something, maybe fear, maybe respect, maybe confusion. She stood up without another word and left the room. As she walked away, I felt a strange sense of release, like a knot inside me had finally begun to loosen. Later, when the house had quieted and most people were settling into their rooms, I remained awake, sitting in the dim living room with only a small lamp on. I needed the stillness. I needed the space to sort through the storm of emotions swirling inside me. My daughter came out, her small footsteps soft against the floor. She joined me on the couch without asking whether she could. I pulled her close and she tucked her head under my chin. Her presence was a reminder of why I had to keep pushing through this transformation. I wasn't just healing for myself. I was healing for her. So she would never grow up thinking silence was noble or that endurance was the price of acceptance. We stayed like that for a long time. Eventually, she fell asleep with her head on my lap. And as I stroked her hair, a deep ache settled into my chest. Not the ache of sadness, but the ache of realization. I had spent years sacrificing myself for people who didn't value me. But here, lying on my lap, was the one person whose future depended on whether I continued repeating those patterns or broke them. She deserved a different kind of mother. One who chose truth over tolerance. One who chose dignity over discomfort. One who chose self-respect over silence. When she finally stirred, I carried her back to bed. On my way to my room, I passed Lydia's door. It was slightly open. I could see her sitting on her bed with her phone in hand, her face illuminated by the screen. Our eyes met for just a second. Not long enough for an exchange, but long enough for something unspoken to pass between us. Tension, resentment, maybe even a flicker of fear. I went into my room and closed the door gently. As I lay down, sleep didn't come immediately. My mind kept replaying the events of the past days, not to relive the pain, but to understand the shift happening inside me. I was changing, and the change felt irreversible. There was a time when I would have apologized to keep the peace. A time when I would have blamed myself simply because blaming myself was easier than dealing with their judgment. A time when I would have swallowed everything until it became a silent sickness inside me. But not anymore. I wasn't the same woman who walked into that house just days ago. Something had broken open. Something had awakened. Something had returned. And I knew, deep in my bones, that the next days would test me even more. Because people don't accept your transformation easily when they benefited from who you used to be. They fight it. They resist it. They resent it. They push harder. But I was ready. For once in my life, I didn't fear their reaction. I only feared going back to being the woman who allowed herself to disappear. And that woman was gone. Gone for good. The day that changed everything started out strangely quiet. I woke up before dawn, my chest tight with a feeling I couldn't explain. The house felt unusually still, as if it was waiting. Even the ticking clock sounded louder than usual. I made breakfast, but the scrambled eggs on the plate tasted like nothing. My mind was too full of the things his family had said, the whispers they thought I didn't hear, the way they looked at me like an outsider wearing a name I didn't deserve. But something inside me had shifted after everything Linda told me. I wasn't going to shrink anymore. I dressed slowly, choosing a simple blouse and jeans. Nothing fancy, just comfortable. But when I looked in the mirror, I saw a woman who no longer bowed her head. A woman who had cried enough. A woman who had been quiet long enough. A woman who finally understood her worth. By the time the sun rose, I had made a decision. I was going to that family gathering. Not as the quiet, obedient wife they thought they could walk over, but as a woman who knew the truth, and was ready to face them with it. When I arrived at their house, conversations died instantly. Heads turned the way they always did, but this time I didn't flinch. I walked past their stairs as though every one of them was a breeze I couldn't feel. His mother was the first to approach me. Her hands were on her hips, her voice sharp like she'd been preparing for a battle. "You came," she said coldly, as if she wished I hadn't. I met her eyes. Yes, I did. Something in my tone made her blink. She wasn't expecting confidence. She wasn't expecting strength. She definitely wasn't expecting me to look her in the eye without fear. But I wasn't the same woman who used to shrink under their words. I was done shrinking. His brother muttered, "She really thinks she belongs here." And normally that comment would have pierced me. But today it simply rolled off my skin like water. I turned toward him, my voice steady. "I don't think I belong here. I know I married into this family. Whatever issues you have with that are yours, not mine." The room went silent. His sister, the only one who ever treated me with an ounce of respect, stepped out from the kitchen and crossed her arms. "I think everyone needs to hear what she has to say," she announced. And just like that, every eye was on me. Every face. Every whisper. Every old wound. My heart pounded, but my voice didn't shake. "I have been treated like an outsider from the moment I stepped into this family," I began. "Not because I disrespected anyone. Not because I wasn't good enough. But because you all decided who I was before you ever bothered to know me." Someone scoffed. Someone shifted uncomfortably. Someone whispered something I ignored. "And I stayed quiet," I continued, "because I thought if I just kept trying, kept serving, kept loving, maybe one day you would see me for who I really am." I took a breath, feeling my chest tighten. But this time it wasn't fear. It was release. "But you didn't. Not once. Instead you used me. Mocked me. Looked down on me. And made me feel like dirt in my own marriage." Several heads dropped. His mother swallowed hard. His brother looked away. "I tolerated it," I said softly. "But that version of me is gone." And just then, right in the middle of the silence, the front door opened. And my husband stepped in. Dirty. Exhausted. Eyes red and sunken. Clothes wrinkled like he hadn't slept in days. Everyone froze. My breath caught. He looked at me, just me, like I was oxygen and he had been suffocating. But before I could speak, before I could move, before I could even breathe, his mother rushed to him. His siblings crowded around him. And I just stood there, watching the man who once promised to protect me being swallowed by the very people who destroyed me. He didn't even look at them. He stepped past them, walked straight to me, and whispered, his voice breaking, "Please, don't leave me." The room went silent again. But this time for a different reason. Because for the first time ever, they saw exactly who he needed. and exactly who they pushed away. The room was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. Everyone stood frozen, watching the way my husband clung to me, as if letting go would break him. His fingers trembled where they touched my wrist, and his breath shook with every word he tried to form. But I didn't say anything yet. I just looked at him. This was the same man who had allowed his family to treat me like I was nothing. The same man who never defended me, never stood between me and their cruelty. The same man who let me cry alone in a marriage I was trying to build with both hands. And now he was standing in front of me like a child terrified of losing the one thing keeping him alive. His siblings exchanged confused looks. His mother wiped her eyes, trying to hide the fact that she was shaken. She wasn't used to seeing her son vulnerable, much less vulnerable with me. I finally spoke, my voice calm but carrying enough force to make every person in that room listen. "Where have you been?" He swallowed hard, eyes lowering like the answer was too heavy to hold. "Trying to fix everything," he whispered. "Trying to fix myself. I was breaking and I didn't want you to carry my weight. But I left you alone. And I'm sorry. I am so sorry." For the first time since I married into this family, there was no defensiveness. No excuses. No shifting blame. Just truth, raw and shivering. He went down on his knees. Gasps filled the room. He took my hands in his forehead resting against them. "You are the only person who has ever loved me without conditions. And I let my family treat you like you were disposable. I let you fight alone. I let them tear you down. And you still stayed." His voice cracked. "I don't deserve you. But please, help me rebuild us." Behind him, his mother's face crumbled. Not out of anger. Not out of pride. But because, maybe for the first time ever, she understood the damage they caused. She stepped forward slowly, the same woman who had once called me a mistake, and placed a shaky hand over her mouth. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I didn't know he needed you like this. I didn't know we were breaking something you were trying to hold together." Her voice was small, almost childlike. "And I'm sorry." His brother turned away, ashamed. His sister walked up to me with tears in her eyes. "You didn't deserve any of it," she said softly. "We judged you before even knowing you." For years I had dreamed of hearing these words. Not because I needed validation, but because I needed acknowledgement of the wounds they had carved into me. I slowly helped my husband to his feet. "You hurt me," I said quietly. "All of you did. But healing isn't impossible. Just not quick. And I won't pretend nothing happened." They nodded, accepting the truth without arguing. I continued, "Respect will not be optional anymore. If I stay in this family, I stay as an equal. Not a shadow. Not a target. Not someone you can blame for everything. I stay as his wife." My husband wiped his eyes and nodded, firm, certain, and protective in a way I had never seen before. "You'll never face them alone again," he said. "Never." For the first time I believed him. We walked out of the house together. Not because everything was fixed. Not because we were suddenly healed. But because for the first time he stood beside me, not behind his family. And as we stepped into the sunlight, I felt something lift off my chest. The fear. The constant shrinking. The silent suffering. I wasn't walking out as the woman they tried to tear apart. I was walking out as the woman who survived it. A woman who learned her worth. A woman who refused to bow again. A woman who understood that loving someone didn't mean accepting disrespect from everyone around them. As he held the door open for me, his voice trembled. "Thank you for not giving up on us." I looked at him, a small, tired smile on my lips. "I didn't stay for them," I said softly. "I stayed for you. But now, you have to stay for me too." He nodded, and in his eyes I saw a man ready to fight for what he almost lost. We drove away, leaving their shocked faces behind. And for the first time in years, I felt free. "Please follow me for no reason."